On the morning of June the 6th, 1944, a 20-year-old German soldier named Heinrich Severloh stared out at the sea from his concrete bunker on Omaha Beach. In his pocket was a letter from his girlfriend, full of promises for a future after Germany's victory. In his hands was an MG-42 machine gun, one of the most terrifying weapons of the war. He was confident. He was ready. He believed in the Atlantic Wall. 12 hours later, American soldiers found him in that same bunker, weeping like a child. He was surrounded by over 13,000 spent shell casings. His gun barrel was melted and warped from the heat. What did this young man see that so utterly broke him? It wasn't just the sight of enemy soldiers. It was the sight of something his mind, his training, and his entire worldview couldn't process. He witnessed the precise moment that the German war machine's greatest illusion shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. Because D-Day, from the German perspective, wasn't just a military defeat. It was a psychological annihilation. They weren't just pushed back. Their very concept of reality was dismantled, piece by horrifying piece, in a single day. And it started with an illusion they had built for themselves, the myth of the invincible fortress. For months, German propaganda had screamed one thing: the Atlantic Wall was unbreakable. And looking around, it was easy for a soldier like Heinrich Severloh to believe it. This wasn't just a line on a map. It was a 2,400-mile monster of concrete and steel stretching from Norway to Spain. On the Normandy coast alone, the Germans had poured 17 million cubic meters of concrete. They had forged 1.2 million tons of steel into fortifications. Hitler himself had called it impregnable. Think about what that meant for the men on the ground. At Omaha Beach, there were 8 massive concrete bunkers, 35 pillboxes, and 85 machine gun nests, all positioned for perfect, overlapping fields of fire. The beach itself was a death trap, sown with over 3,700 obstacles, spiked Belgian gates, sharp steel hedgehogs, and teller mines hidden just below the tide. And behind it all lay a staggering 6.5 million landmines. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, had personally inspected Severloh's position just days earlier. He peered through the gun sight, nodded with satisfaction, and declared, "When they come, this beach will be their cemetery." This was the promise, a meat grinder designed to chew up any invasion force and spit it back into the sea. German commanders had done the math. Colonel Ernst Goth, commanding the 916th Grenadier Regiment, calculated his artillery could blanket the beaches with 120 rounds per minute. They had the guns, the concrete, and the confidence. So what could possibly go wrong? The first crack in this fortress wasn't made by a bomb or a shell. It was a whisper on the wind. The German High Command was utterly convinced that an invasion was impossible in early June. Their top meteorologist in Paris, Walter Stube, had looked at his charts at the 25-knot winds and 6-foot waves and declared the weather unfit for an invasion for at least 2 weeks. This forecast was a godsend. It meant senior officers could relax. Rommel himself left for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, carrying a pair of gray suede shoes he'd bought for her in Paris. General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army, sent his divisional commanders to attend war games inland at Rennes. Even the naval patrols were canceled. The Atlantic Wall was on a holiday, but the Allies had a secret weapon Stube didn't know about: weather stations in Greenland and reconnaissance flights over the Atlantic. They saw something the Germans couldn't, a tiny 36-hour break in the storm. It was a sliver of a chance, a gambler's throw, and Eisenhower took it. As German commanders slept soundly, believing the weather was their greatest ally, the largest naval armada in human history was already slicing through the choppy waters of the English Channel. The impregnable wall was about to be hit by a tidal wave, and its watchmen were looking the wrong way. As the first gray light of dawn broke on June 6th, German lookouts peered through their binoculars and saw something that defied all logic. The horizon was gone. It had been replaced by a solid wall of ships. Not dozens, not hundreds. Thousands. From one end of the sea to the other, a dense gray carpet of vessels covered the water. The official count was 6,939 ships, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, and thousands of support and merchant vessels. For the German soldiers raised on propaganda about Allied weakness, this was a psychological blow from which they would never recover. It was as if an entire industrial nation had floated across the Channel to personally erase them from the map. One officer, Bernhard Firking, was heard telling his men, "This is not an invasion. The whole world has come to fight us." And then, at 05:35, that world opened. Fire. Nothing in the experience of these German soldiers, not even the brutal Eastern Front, had prepared them for the hell that was unleashed. This wasn't an artillery barrage. It was a steel hurricane. The battleship USS Texas fired 205 14-inch shells, each one the weight of a small car, into the German positions at Pointe du Hoc in just 34 minutes. The concrete bunkers, designed to withstand any bomb, began to crack and crumble like sandcastles. Men were buried alive in their impregnable fortress, dug out by their comrades, only to be buried again by the next salvo. The noise was so immense, so bone-shattering, that it ceased to be sound and became a physical force, crushing the will to resist. The promise of the Atlantic Wall, the fortress that would be their enemy's grave, was being pulverized into dust before the first Allied soldier even touched the sand. The first illusion had been shattered. As the sea erupted, another critical piece of the German defense plan was supposed to kick in: air power. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, had famously promised that German skies would remain German. His Knights of the Air were meant to swoop down and decimate any invasion fleet. So where were they? The desperate call went out to Oberst Josef Pips Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26. The order: attack the invasion fleet with your entire force. His response, recorded in the Wing's war diary, has become legendary for its tragic absurdity. He supposedly yelled back into the phone, "What entire force? I have 2 planes." While the quote's exact wording is debated, the reality is not. The once mighty Luftwaffe was a hollow shell. On D-Day, the Allies flew 14,674 sorties over Normandy. The Germans managed just 319. The symbol of this total impotence came when Priller and his wingman, Heinz Wodarczyk, actually took to the air. In their Focke-Wulf 190s, they made the only Luftwaffe attack on the landing beaches that morning. They screamed in low over Sword Beach, strafing the sand with machine gun fire for a few terrifying seconds before being chased off by an overwhelming swarm of Allied fighters. 2 planes. 2 planes against an invasion force of thousands of ships and tens of thousands of men. The Knights of the Air had been reduced to a single, futile gesture. The second illusion, that Germany still controlled the skies, had vanished in a puff of smoke over the English Channel. With the wall crumbling and the air force non-existent, Germany's last trump card was its panzer divisions. These were the armored fists that had smashed through Poland, France, and Russia. Rommel's plan was clear. The moment the Allies landed, the panzers would storm the beaches and drive them back into the sea. The 21st Panzer Division, a formidable force, was positioned just miles from the coast, ready to strike. So why didn't it move? Because the German command structure had descended into a complete farce. As reports of paratroopers and landings flooded headquarters, Nobody knew what was real and what was a diversion. Was this the main attack, or a feint to draw their forces away from the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais? Major Hans von Luck, a commander in the 21st Panzer, was awakened by reports of paratroopers landing all around him. He knew instantly this was it. He requested permission to attack, to hit the British paratroopers before they could dig in. The response from his superiors was chilling. Do not move until the situation clarifies. Von Luck later wrote, I knew at that moment we were lost. The Panzers, the one force that could have turned the tide, sat paralyzed by indecision. And the reason for that indecision went all the way to the top. The most powerful panzer divisions couldn't be released without a direct order from Adolf Hitler himself. But on the morning of the most important battle of the war, Hitler was asleep. His aides were too terrified to wake him. So, as American soldiers were dying by the hundreds on Omaha Beach, the tanks that were supposed to annihilate them sat waiting for a sleeping dictator to give the order. By the time the 21st Panzer finally received orders to attack at 10 a.m., 4 critical hours had been wasted. They finally reached the coast in the evening, the only German armored unit to do so on D-Day. But as they arrived, they looked up and saw the sky filled with 250 Allied gliders, bringing in massive reinforcements. Fearing they were about to be encircled, they withdrew. The armored fist that was meant to deliver the knockout blow had managed only a timid jab before retreating into the darkness. The third illusion, the decisive power of the Panzers, was dead. Now let's go back to Heinrich Severloh in his bunker, WN-62. The naval bombardment had miraculously spared his position. As the ramps of the first Higgins boats dropped, he opened fire with his MG-42. For the next 9 hours, he poured a relentless stream of lead into the American soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division. He fired in short, controlled bursts, changing out red-hot barrels, feeding belt after belt of ammunition, a one-man killing machine. He later claimed to have fired 13,500 rounds and inflicted up to 2,000 casualties, a number historians dispute. But there is no doubt he was responsible for an incredible amount of carnage on what the Americans would call Bloody Omaha. Severloh was the perfect example of the German military ideal, highly trained, disciplined, and lethally effective. And for a few hours, his individual skills seemed to matter. But he was about to learn the most brutal lesson of modern warfare. It didn't matter how many men he killed, because there were always more. He would watch in disbelief as landing craft were ripped apart by shells, only to see 3 more arrive to take its place. For every American soldier that fell on the sand, 10 more were coming down the ramps. This was a new kind of horror. German soldiers began to suffer from what military historians call material shock. It's the psychological breakdown that occurs when a soldier realizes his bravery, his skill, and even his life are completely irrelevant in the face of an enemy with seemingly infinite resources. They were fighting a hydra. Every head they cut off was replaced by 2 more. By midday, the inevitable happened. Severloh and the other defenders started running out of ammunition. Their entire defensive plan was based on repelling a limited assault. No one had calculated for an enemy that could absorb catastrophic losses and just keep coming. Artillery batteries, which were supposed to have enough ammunition for a 3-day battle, exhausted their supplies in a few hours. When they tried to bring up reserves, they found every road, every bridge, every crossroads was being relentlessly pounded by Allied fighter bombers. The contrast was sickening. German observers watched in horror as American destroyers sailed dangerously close to shore, firing hundreds of 5-inch shells at a single machine gun nest, while their own artillery was being rationed to 4 shells per gun for the rest of the day. The German soldier was fighting with a rifle against a factory. And in that moment, the fourth and perhaps most cherished illusion died. The idea that the superior German warrior could triumph through sheer will and skill. He couldn't. He was just a cog in a machine that was being systematically dismantled by a much, much bigger one. As darkness fell on June the 6th, the Atlantic Wall was breached. The Allies had secured 5 beachheads. The story of D-Day was over. But for the German army in Normandy, the nightmare was just beginning. The days and weeks that followed were a slow, grinding descent into hell, where every remaining illusion was burned away. The illusion of tactical victory was next. In the days after the landing, the SS tank ace, Michael Wittmann, provided Germany with a rare piece of good news. In a single engagement at Villers-Bocage, his Tiger tanks single-handedly destroyed as many as 14 British tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and over a dozen transport vehicles in about 15 minutes. It was a stunning display of skill. Propaganda hailed it as proof of German superiority. But the incident revealed a deeper, more terrible truth. Wittmann's Tiger, disabled in the fight, was a complex machine that was difficult to repair and almost impossible to replace. The 14 British tanks he destroyed, they were replaced within hours. Wittmann had won the battle, but in doing so, he had proven exactly why Germany was going to lose the war. Tactical brilliance meant nothing against industrial mathematics. A few months later, Wittmann himself was killed, his Tiger obliterated by an enemy that could afford to lose 10 tanks to kill one of his. The final illusion to die was the very hope of survival. The Allied breakout, Operation Cobra, was preceded by a bombardment so colossal it defies description. Over 2,400 Allied bombers dropped more than 4,000 tons of explosives on a tiny slice of the German line. The commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, Fritz Bayerlein, sent a frantic report. "My division is annihilated. The psychological effect on the survivors is indescribable. They are no longer soldiers, but broken men." The bombing was so intense it even killed an American general, Leslie McNair, who was observing from what was considered a safe distance. If their own generals weren't safe from their firepower, what chance did a German soldier in a foxhole have? What was left of the German army was finally trapped in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. It was an apocalyptic scene. The roads were a tangled mess of burned-out tanks, dead horses, and dead men. Allied fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos, circled overhead like vultures, attacking anything that moved. For the men trapped inside, the choice was simple: surrender or be vaporized. 50,000 chose surrender. In his final report to Hitler before being wounded, Field Marshal Rommel wrote the blunt, terrifying truth. The troops are fighting heroically everywhere, but the unequal struggle is nearing its end. I must beg you to draw the necessary conclusions without delay. It was military code for "we have lost." The German soldiers in Normandy learned that modern war wasn't won by warriors, it was won by factory workers. They saw firsthand that America didn't just send an army to France, it sent an entire industrial ecosystem. Ford's Willow Run plant was producing a B-24 bomber every hour. In 1944 alone, America built 96,000 aircraft. The Allies could land 15,000 tons of supplies every day on the Normandy beaches, more than the entire German army consumed in a week. This is what broke Heinrich Severloh. It wasn't fear. It wasn't cowardice. It was the soul-crushing realization that his courage was meaningless. His 13,500 bullets had changed nothing. He had spent his day in a slaughterhouse, but the cattle just kept coming, endless and unstoppable. He began June 6th as a proud soldier of the Third Reich, a believer in its strength and destiny. He ended it as a witness to something far more powerful: the awesome, terrifying efficiency of the arsenal of democracy. He had been promised a glorious victory on a cemetery of his enemies' making. Instead, he and the entire German army were swept away by a tide of steel, carrying with it the last desperate illusions of a dying regime.